Lee?
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. It's Lee McIntyre. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Lee.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about disinformation, which you ended with. I wonder if you could say a little bit, if you have done any research on where the disinformation about COVID vaccines is coming from. I remember there was a piece in the New York Times a few years back called Putin's Long War Against American Science, showing that a lot of the science denial disinformation was coming out of Russia. And then there was a little blip on that in the American media in about November, or I'm sorry, in about March or April of this year, about Russian disinformation about science in general. But I've been curious in particular about disinformation having to do with the vaccines. And I wonder if your research has turned up anything on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of actors who are really active in the disinformation space around the COVID vaccine. There have been several recent studies published that suggest that a huge percentage of the disinformation is coming from a very small number of accounts. And so I think that's one key point. Our foreign adversaries, especially China and Russia, are very active in this space. Russia really is agnostic on the specific topics on which they spread disinformation, and also on the specific messages they send. Their main goal is to create chaos, to undermine our confidence in institutions, and they see what works. And so their activity in this COVID space is extensive. Because they see the extent to which it erodes confidence in science institutions, in government institutions, and it really casts doubt on the ability of Western governments to tackle this big challenge. The fact that it's a partisan issue just makes it that much easier. So they're very active in fueling this. China increasingly also is involved in this space. A few years ago, it was safe to say that China had sort of a different approach to disinformation online, which was that they did care what you believed. They wanted you to take a specific set of beliefs that conformed with what they wanted you to believe. So rather than trying to spread chaos like Russia, they were much more focused on managing the specific perception and kind of shaping people's views. So there's still some of that, but they also now are recognizing the success, at least in the U.S. context, of this chaos strategy, and so are moving in that direction. In the COVID space, China is very focused on the blame, the attribution question, whose fault is it, and also on their own vaccines. To both the Western and also especially the developing world, this idea that their vaccines are better than the US vaccines, that Pfizer and Moderna and those types of vaccines don't work, and trying to use vaccines diplomacy in a really major way. But I don't want to then suggest that there aren't really important domestic actors also spreading anti-vax sentiment. There definitely are. The biggest spreaders are obviously coming from kind of the partisan motive, so the extremes. But they come from the extremes on both sides. So, you do have a substantial percentage of the, at least in the US context, of people who have anti-vax sentiments, kind of explicitly driven by this partisan motive. But it's important to recognize that there's also a huge number of anti-vax people who believe that it's unsafe for other types of reasons, and who are on the left. Like, before COVID, anti-vax sentiment was actually stronger in some contexts in the extreme left. People who felt that it was, they were unhealthy and they had this kind of like extreme natural type of health attitudes. So I think, there's a wide array of actors spreading mis and disinformation. And the key point, I think, from a policy perspective is that the response to each one of those actors and each one of those narratives has to be different. Like the way in which we respond and try to counter Russian disinformation is different from the way we respond to disinformation coming from China is different from the way in which we respond to partisan-based disinformation, et cetera.
Can we go to Stephen and then go back? Because I think you're going to respond to something right here.
Yeah. Thanks. Stephen Lewandowski here from the University of Bristol. Thanks for the talk. I applaud the systemic approach, which I think is really important. But I do want to make two comments on things you said. The first one about the most recent one about anti-vax being an extreme left phenomenon as well. Perhaps anecdotally, there's evidence perhaps for that to be the case. But if you look at large scale surveys, like 1,000 representative Americans or 2,000 or whatever, it just doesn't show up. And that's because there are so few hard left people. You never recruit them in a sample. What you do get is a systematic right wing anti-vax association in the United States, and as it turns out, also in Europe. So what we're seeing now in terms of polarization is actually not new. It is accentuated, but it's not new. And the other comment I was going to make is, of course, you're right that there's now a lot of anti-vax sentiment being articulated, especially in the United States with the COVID vaccines, and that is really problematic. But I think it's also true, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, again, if you look at the data at a population level, there's actually quite a bit of evidence now that during the last year or so, anti-vax sentiments vis-a-vis COVID have actually declined, including in the United States, and that the vaccination campaigns, certainly in Europe, have generated their own momentum. And yes, there is a very noisy, hardcore, vigorously opposed segment of the population, but by and large, people are getting vaccinated, certainly in Europe. And there's also data from various European countries, Germany and the UK come to mind, that have revealed a dramatic increase in the public's trust in scientists. In Germany last year, it tripled the number of people who fully trust scientists as a consequence of the pandemic. So, and the reason I'm mentioning that is because Chris made a similar point this morning that, as much as we study misinformation, we shouldn't forget that actually, things aren't all bad. And so I think we can point to some public opinion data that are quite encouraging when it comes to COVID-19 vaccinations. That's not to deny, all the Russian bots and all the problems you've talked about, but I think we do have to keep it a little bit in quantitative perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I'm not as familiar with the European context, so that's a helpful clarification. On the left-leaning anti-vax sentiment, I think the reason why it's worth noting is because it's often concentrated in specific communities, and so it can have an outsized effect. So some of the highest rates of anti-vax sentiment before COVID were in really wealthy California cities, like up near San Francisco and down near LA. The reason why that's important is just because when you have that concentration of people who aren't getting vaccinated against any type of disease, you have the risk of outbreaks, which can have significant consequences. So I think that's why we recognize that, it is a cross spectrum thing, but you're right, especially now around COVID, that it's a very small percentage.
If I may, Jennifer,
you may.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, this is Marcelo Suarez Orozco. I'm the chancellor at UMass Boston. For 10 years, I was the dean of UCLA's oldest school, and my responsibility was to manage the oldest laboratory school in the United States, the UCLA Lab School on the west side of LA in Westwood. And it is indeed the case that every year it was a battle to take on the parents to vaccinate the children. And these were the children of many of the movie stars we all come to love and appreciate for their art. They did not want to vaccinate their children. So that's an N of one, but I think it tells a powerful story of another variant of this virus that we have.
Yes, Jennifer, Riccardo Pozzo, Tor Vergata University here in Rome. I have a question about a marginal. So I'm amazed by the precision of your reconstruction, your survey. I have a question about the marginal group, namely sedentary versus mobile. And now we are currently having 50 million people that are migrating. And these 50 million people today are connected. We know they are connected. They are heavily connected also when they come to their country destination. Are you including these marginal groups in your surveys? Do they play a role?
Well, the surveys that I was citing, specifically the ones that RAND has conducted, rely on RAND's American Life panel. So first, they're specific to the US context. The panel is only US based individuals. RAND's, it's a nationally representative sample, and we provide, for anybody who's selected into the sample that doesn't have access to internet and the technology to participate, we provide it to them. So that's the sample that that we use for our surveys here at RAND. I agree 100% that any type of a global level survey and even a national one is going to miss people. We've seen recently some of the limitations of surveys and polls around these types of issues in terms of actually getting a finger on of what actually people are believing and how they're actually going to behave. And so that's why I think when I mentioned a couple of times thinking about community-based research and making sure that we're actually like in these communities, that we're not just relying on large N survey samples, but that we are trying to build relationships with organizations that are working on the ground with, whether it's mobile populations that are moving around a lot and are harder to capture, or whether it's communities that are really lacking in the types of technology that we're referencing here. Those types of communities are also affected by disinformation, but they're affected by disinformation in different ways. So we have a project here at RAND that's actually focused on that specific question. Again, it's US based, but we're trying to understand how different communities are affected differently, especially focused on these underserved populations that aren't going to be captured in surveys. They may not be reading their information online, and yet we still see them articulating these types of mis and disinformation, and they have severely low levels of trust in institutions. So the problem is very different. It's one more of trust and of trying to find what are the sources of information these people are using. And so I think that's a way that we're trying to get at the problem. But I would say that most research on disinformation thus far hasn't done a good job of capturing those populations. But I think more researchers are moving in that direction, recognizing that it's a gap.
So we only have 5 minutes left, but we want to get 2 questions in, Chris and Stefano.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Jennifer, nice to meet you. My name is Chris Bale from Duke. I really liked your holistic, really bringing everything together is really useful, because often we're grabbing different parts of the proverbial elephant here. One thing, though, I thought might have been left out is kind of, and this came up earlier in Marty's speech and some of the conversations we've been having over coffee here, is like, what's the role of the elites here? One Trump tweet goes, infinitely farther than any other number of people's tweets. But also, I recently read this really interesting working paper, and this is kind of a question for the group too, maybe, that showed, at least in America, we have this idea that Republicans and Democrats are a million miles apart on most issues. But when you look at dozens of surveys, high quality surveys, General Social Survey, the American National Election Survey, and so on, the average gap in knowledge questions, whether you think the earth is flat or whether you think COVID is caused by a Chinese lab and so on, is just 4 points out of 100. So it's just one working paper. That much more research has to be done. But from an intervention standpoint, is there anything, given that RAND is such a leader in this area and in Washington, is there any way to move the elites and the rest of us will follow? Yeah,
that's a really important question. So first of all, I think there's a lot of research that's been done on the importance of elite opinion. What you think about like Adam Berinsky and people like that show that, at least in the foreign policy context, like where go elites, there goes the population. And so thinking about how we move and how we get kind of whatever we're calling the elites, whether that's like politicians or just kind of people who hold powerful positions of influence, how we make sure, how we build kind of an army of those individuals who are able to swing attitudes, I think is really important. So identifying influencers and who are the key influencers who are able to shape opinion in that way is a kind of key area that we're focused on, is trying to think, who do we reach out to? On the question, I think there have been actually a number of studies that suggest that even though we focus in the US on the polarization, a lot of most issues, we're really much more in a purple space. So there's like a few key issues that really divide people, and in the other spaces, there's a lot more mixing. But those key issues are like the ones that everyone points to. And now we're in this situation where a lot of polarization is driven by kind of this affective polarization, like what Liliana Mason writes about, this sense in which we like hate each other and we have this perception of what the other side is, even though we actually agree on a ton of stuff. And that's why this idea of deliberation is so important that Jane was mentioning, because we figure out in those conversations that we actually agree on a lot. I think there's a pretty big role for kind of elite influencers, but I think that those influencers are going to, like, it's key to identify who those elites are, because the elites for one group aren't going to be the elites for another group. And so thinking about who those key influencers can be, and helping to craft messages that they can use to kind of shape attitudes is really important. But then I keep coming back in the US context to, like, can we ever bridge like polarization if we can't, like at the local level, if we can't get like political leaders in Congress and in state houses to like have a more effective working relationship? Because people see that kind of animosity and that's what they think everything is about. And I don't know. And so then we're back at this question of how do we like fundamentally like reset political institutions? And that's like a huge challenge that is really daunting to overcome. So then when I feel really discouraged, like, oh, why am I even doing this? There's no hope. I think you kind of take a step back and think about like starting again at the local level. Okay, so I can't take on like the US Congress, but maybe I can think about how we can develop mechanisms that change it at the local level, in local governments, things like that. So I'd love to have a longer conversation about this, but I know there's one more question and I've already taken too long, so I'm going to stop, but I'm happy to revisit this later with you, Chris.
Last question, Stefano.
Thank you. I have a very quick question to you, Jenny. Towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned that in order to cope with the problem, you are suggesting increase science and media literacy. Now, I have a case in Italy, which is my country. Last week, 600 signatures from academics who are collected, most of them were also scientists, against vaccines, COVID vaccine. And they said, we are not against truth. The point is that the other colleagues, they are against truth because they cannot prove what we are claiming. So technically speaking, that is not a case of post-truth, technically speaking, because they said, we want to establish truth. And why is that so? Because they raised, among them, there were three important philosophers. Perhaps Ricardo knows them personally, and they are also well known abroad, because they raised an epistemological problem. They said science today has lost its grip on reality because it does not make a causal analysis, but only correlation analysis. And correlations are no good in establishing a truth, because you need to have causality. And so that is the point where we are stuck in this period. What is your reaction? Supposing that you were to live in Italy, how would you react to those 600 people? Thank you, Jenny.
I think it's obviously, I agree 100% that correlation is not causality. And we have to be very careful about how we frame our quantitative analyses, and then we're not overstating the evidence that we have. And so, I spend a lot of time, I do a lot of like quality assurance reviews here at RAND. I spend a lot of time correcting people's causal language and making it associational. Like, we don't want to overstate our evidence. And we obviously, science evolves. Science changes as we get better data, as we get better methods to study that data. And so I think understanding the way in which scientific knowledge does change and does evolve over time is a really important piece of this. So I guess I would agree with, with the general sentiment that we want to be careful and rigorous about our scientific data. So then the question becomes, has the data that's been collected thus far met that standard? I am a big proponent of delegating to people who know more than me. I am a political scientist, but I am not an infectious disease expert, and I don't know a lot about vaccines and how they work. So, I can only trust the evidence that's been presented to me. But going a step backwards to this idea of media literacy and scientific literacy, I think what's important that we teach people is a way of thinking. It's not about what to believe, but it's how to think about information, how to consume online information. What are the questions I need to ask to understand if this is a good source? Who are the experts that I should be turning to in this area? What is the scientific method? What counts as a rigorous study? How does scientific knowledge evolve? This is what people need to understand, so that they understand the kind of basic concepts and the basic practices and institutions behind the evidence they're being presented with. We can't expect that we're going to make everybody an expert on vaccines, but we can teach them how to contextualize the information that they're getting, how to distinguish between something that is scientifically rigorous and is a good scientific study and something that's based on an N of 1 or an N of 10. How to ask questions. I mean, a great example is like the reporting on breakthrough cases. Like when they started releasing breakthrough cases, there was something like for Washington, D.C., it was like, there have been 500 breakthrough cases. Yeah, out of like several 100,000 vaccines, right? So it's a really small percentage. And if you just read that headline without having like, knowledge of statistics and stuff, that could be really alarming. So I think that's where I would go with this group of people, is to kind of focus on what should we be teaching people so that they can make informed decisions.
Jennifer, thank you for an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me again.